George Harold Bramble. I was born in Albion, Michigan, July 12, 1922.
Who were your parents?
My parents were Ross and Josephine Bramble. My mother's maiden name was Casey. So
What about her parents?
her parents were John and Mary Casey.
What do you remember about them?
I remember my grandpa Bramble was a little short, wiry man with a bald head and a handlebar mustache. And I remember my grandma Casey as being always seen her in an apron because she was always in the kitchen cooking and baking. And
Since Grandma took that after, huh?
so, and I think my mother picked that up after her because my mother done the same thing. Was always in the kitchen baking or cooking. And
they had a farm, didn't they?
yeah, they always, my grandpa Casey always farmed all of his life. And don't marry. And
And who were your dad's folks?
my dad's folks was Catherine and James Bramble, and they both came from England. My grandma Bramble was an Irishman, and she met my grandpa Bramble in England, and they got married in England, and they migrated to the United States. And I really don't know what my grandpa Bramble done for a living. I know he planted a lot of potatoes, and I don't know what he did for a living. I don't think he had to work, really.
You told me that he owned a lot of property here in town.
Yeah, he had a lot of property in Albion. Well, then when they first come to the United States, they settled on a farm over by Homer, and he was a farmer. Then after they got up in age, they moved to Albion, and then he invested in a little real estate, and that's about all I remember of them, because they died when I was real young. So I do remember what they looked like and who they was.
Do you remember what your grandpa and Grandma Bramble looked like?
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you tell us
What they looked
what they
like?
look like?
Oh, he was about a medium-built man and bald-headed, and he had a real English accent because he was right from England. And my grandma Bramble, I remember her real well because she used to bake cookies, and we used to go there when we were kids, and she made damn sure you only got one cook, and she didn't give you any more than one. And sometimes I don't think she wanted us to have that, but
Really?
she was just taking them out of the oven, so we caught her with a pan in her hand. So anyway, so then in when I'll talk about Greenfield.
Well, how about we go just a little bit slower, okay? What would you say is your earliest recollection of your dad? Earliest recollection you have of your dad?
Oh, my dad. Earliest recollection I have of my dad. Okay. I really remember what my dad was like and what he looked like. He had a job at the Kelsey Hayes Wheel here in Albion, Michigan, and we lived outside of town on a little farm. He didn't farm. We just lived in a house, rented it from somebody. And he drove a Model T coupe with no, it was a convertible light to work. And then us kids went to school in Albion. And when we get out of school in Albion, we'd walk out to the Kelsey Hayes shop. And then we'd get in the car and we'd all ride home. That wasn't a sight going down a country road. All these kids hanging on this old car. But and then my dad worked in the shop for a while, and then in 1932, I think it was, my dad decided to go into farming. So we worked for a while for my uncle, Ed Casey, on a farm, Lockwood Farm, and that was west of Marshall on the Verona Road. But him and my dad never could see eye to eye, so we didn't stay there too long, and then that was long before electricity. But what I remember about that place the most was that they had a Delco plant. That's what they had before they got electricity. It was a motor that would run and had a generator on it and created our own electricity. When the motor stopped, your lights would go out, you know. So you had to make sure you had kept gas. I think it was gas or kerosene it run on. And so anyway, my dad worked there for a while. And then another thing I remember about that place distinctly is my uncle raised a lot of big longhorn Texas steers, and they'd bring them into Marshall for the stockyards. In cattle freight cars, they'd unload them in Marshall. Of course, they wasn't trucking cattle and stuff back then, so they had horses on horseback. They unloaded the cattle and drove the cattle from the stockyard in Marshall out to the Lockwood place on the Verona Road, which would be about 4 to 5 miles out of Marshall, and maybe a couple hundred head of cattle. And I remember us kids would get all excited when we heard them coming down the road. It's a gravel road, and that was when these longhorn cattle had horns maybe 5 foot wide. You know, they were real longhorn cattle from right out of Texas. And they were wilder than rabbits because they've been riding on the rails all the way from Texas to Marshall. And so then we stayed there for a while, and then we moved over to another big farm, which was called the Greenfield Farm. And that was 3 miles south of Therese, Michigan. And what I remember about that, my two brothers and I were just, I think I was 12 or 13, and then my other brother was 14, then our younger brother was probably 11 or 12. And so this was a big working farm. It was 440 acres. And my dad worked it all with 4 horses, 2 teams of horses. And we had a big woods on the place, and the schoolhouse was right on our farm. All we had to do was walk down the country lane, hit the farm, and climb over the fence, and we was right in the schoolyard. In fact, the school set it surrounded our land, so we didn't have far to go to school. And so anyway, while we lived on this farm, we had one old horse that always had the colic, so my dad didn't work her very much. Her name was Flora. So that when my dad didn't work her, we'd ask him could we ride her around the yard. So we'd take turns getting on her back, get off the porch and on her back, ride her around the yard. And we also had a goat by the name of Billy. And that was one of our pets, and everywhere we went, he followed us just like a dog would. And speaking of dogs, while we lived on this farm, my brothers and I were playing out. The driveway had kind of a downfall to it out to the road, and it usually was forced out a little bit, and so that made a little sand pile there. So we'd go out and play in this sand pile. So we were playing in this sand one afternoon, so up the driveway came this dog. It was part shepherd and part collie. And he come up the driveway wagging his tail, and so it got up where we was and it started licking our face and everything. And so it was a real friendly dog, and we found out later it was a genuine cattle dog trained at herding cattle. And before we got the dog, us boys had to take turns going back, way back in the field and driving the cows up the lane to be milked at night, and then driving them back down there in the morning. But after we got Shep, we didn't have to do that anymore because he'd hang around. He was so smart. He knew just about what time the milking time was, and so he'd hang around us real close. And we'd say to him, "Okay, Shep, time to go get the cows." And away he'd go. And but he'd go back and get the cows, and we had to drive maybe a good quarter of a mile from the field up the lane, and he'd walk behind them. He'd keep walking from one side of the lane to the other, and if one of the cows got lagging behind a little bit, he'd go up and nip her in the leg. He kept them real even all the way up. Then we had a gate that stopped when he got to the barnyard, so when he got him up there, he'd bark till we'd come down and open the gate and let the cows in the barn. And then he was real smart. If you wanted a particular cow brought out of the barnyard, you just point which one you wanted, and he'd get that one. Instead of getting all of them, he'd get that one. And same way with pigs. We had a bunch of pigs around there, and so my dad would want one particular pig and point his finger at the pig, and the dog would bring that one instead of the other one. And the way he handled pigs, they're real stubborn anyway. He'd just get a hold of their leg and kind of bite on it and twist it, and this would make this hog go. He'd try to sit down, and he'd just keep it going. And so then we also had a bunch of sheep and chickens, and didn't have any money because, like I was telling you before, back in the Depression time, we didn't have any money, but we always had plenty to eat because we had our own poultry, eggs, pigs, beef that we butchered, and hogs that we butchered. And it was better to eat them than sell them because at that time hogs were selling for 3 cents a pound. It just almost, in fact, it was almost impossible to sell hogs. Nobody wanted them. Nobody wanted to sell them for that much money. But my dad, every once in a while, would sell a load of them, and he'd get a little change in his pocket, I guess.
I know I've seen photos of farmers pouring out their milk because they couldn't sell it. It was worthless, and they couldn't use it either.
Then we had us kids would carry the milk up to the house in big milk cans, bigger milk cans. And we had a Dia valve separator. I don't know if you know what that is or not. It had a big basin on the top, and you pour the milk out of the pail into the separator, and you turn the crank, and it had 2 spigots on it. Milk would come out one spigot, and cream would come out the other. That's why they call it a separator, because it separated the milk from the cream. And so my mother made our own butter, and then what excess cream we had, the milkman would come along once a week and pick it up and take it to Litchfield Dairy, and we sold it to them, and that was another little bit of income we had. And sheep, I remember we had a lot of sheep, and in the summertime we always pastured them maybe 8 or 9 miles from home in a big field that they was leasing, or farm they was leasing off from some man, just for that purpose. And then in the fall of the year, we'd always have to go over and drive the sheep home when it was time to shear them, and we didn't leave them out there all winter. We'd bring them home and shear them and then leave them at home. And so us kids would always go along to help drive the sheep. And I'll tell you, the road was full of them, from fence to fence. And then we had to be down the corner and make them turn. And when we got home, we had to make them turn and go up the driveway and then into the barnyard, into the sheep barn. It was a great big sheep barn. Probably held 300 or 400 sheep easy. And then we had like wherever you have cows, you have a bull. So we had a big bull, and his name was Alex. And he was real dangerous bull. My dad wouldn't let us kids get anywhere around him. In fact, he built a pen in the barn for the bull. It looked just like a great big jail cell. He built it out of oak 4x4s, and and nailed him to the beams or fastened him to the beams of the barn to confine him in the barn. And then when he did take him out to the water tank to water, he'd have to he had a ring in his nose like most bulls did have. And he had a big long stick with a snap on it. And he put that snap in his, hook it on his ring. And then he'd get poles lengths from that bull, you know, so that he could at least defend himself a little bit if he did attack him. And then finally got so ugly and mean that we couldn't keep him confined. He just knocked those 4x4s down like he was kindling wood if he so desired. So we finally had a man come with a cattle truck, picked him up and sold him for beef. And so the school that we went to, we took a trip out there about a week ago out to this old farm to see how it had changed. And actually it hasn't changed at all, other than being a lot older and the people that live in it are real old, but they've kept the house well maintained. It was a great big brick 2-story house built up on a hill and a beautiful setting. And it had big pine trees in the front yard, and the schoolhouse that I went to back in the 1930s is still there today. The woodshed's on the back of it, just like it was when I went to school there. The only thing is, it's not a schoolhouse anymore. It's just a little country church, but they haven't altered the building any. Oh, yeah, they have too. They built a little more room onto it than we had before when I was going to school. And so then work started picking up in factories during the Depression. And so my dad, I don't think my dad was a true farmer. The man that we worked at farm on shares, and his name was Ed Greenfield. And he was the head of the land bank, and farm land bank or loan or something in Marshall, and he owned the farm, and he almost begged my dad to buy the farm because he said, you got 3 boys coming up here, and pretty soon you'll have all kinds of help, because my dad was getting real tired of running that 440-acre farm by himself, and I can realize that. But he couldn't talk my dad into buying it. In fact, he offered it to us for a real reasonable price, and he offered to take a little, every time we get a cash crop, he offered to take that as the payment on the farm, and eventually we would have owned it. And I wasn't very old, but I was really mad at my dad to think that he told him no, and we decided to move back to Albion. And my dad went to work for the Kelsey Hayes. He was a machinist in the shop, and so I've lived in Albion ever since. And
what would you say is your earliest recollection of your mom?
Earliest recollection of my mom.
Or something that might stand out in your mind about when you were real little.
Well, how well she could bake, and how well she fed us, and how she planned the meals so that we had plenty of abundance to eat. In fact, a lot of our relation that lived in Battle Creek, our cousins, my aunt and uncle, I remember they had 3 boys, and there was none of them working, so they didn't have hardly enough to eat. So every Sunday they would come to our house because my mother always had chicken and dumplings and all kinds of potatoes and gravy, and she was just a terrific cook. So they'd come to our house, needless to say, they'd come about every Sunday. And then work finally picked up in Battle Creek, and they got a job. And they didn't come quite as often, but I'm sure they appreciated that we had food to give them. And so then...
How about your aunts and uncles? I know that folks, I don't think you had telephones, but they used to get together maybe once a week and play cards.
No, that wasn't my aunts and uncles.
Wasn't your aunts and uncles?
That was the neighbors around the neighborhood.
Okay.
And one particular family I remember is the Snitchers, and they had twin boys. They was a little bit older than us boys, and then they had a daughter, Laura May, and then they had the oldest daughter was named Bernice, and their last name was Snitzer, and she had an old 1927 Model T car, and their dad left home when the kid was all little, so the mother more or less was left to bring them up. So Bernice was the one that was the breadwinner in the family. She works at the grocery store in Ceresco. So she had to drive about 3 or 4 miles to work every day, and then she'd drive home at night, and I can hear her going by yet with that old Model T horn going, ooga, ooga, you know, and we'd all know what time it was when Bernice went home. And so we used to play cards, go over to their house and play cards with them, and they'd come to our house and play cards.
Didn't have a telephone though. How did you
Didn't have any
signal?
telephone. Didn't have, well, they just said, well, now we played here this week. You come to our house next week, and then she had the car. Bernice had the car, so she'd go around and make tell different families there's going to be a big card game at such and such a house. It's going to be a potluck. Bring a dish to pass. And I remember this. This was really true. What do you say? You know, everybody was just like brothers and sisters to each other, and real good friends. Everybody in the not everybody in the neighborhood, but 4 or 5 families in the neighborhood would get together all the time, and then in the wintertime, us kids would go skating on an old frozen pond across the road with clamp on skates. If you never wore clamp on skates, you've never been anywhere. So, anyway, the little town of Ceresco, what always fascinated me was they had a big dam there, and they generated their own electricity for the city of Therese, and I guess maybe part of Marshall. But where we lived on the Greenfield farm back in the 30s, they hadn't come through with rural electricity yet. So we had oil lamps, and we had a supply tank sitting by our kitchen sink, and it was fed by the windmill. We had a windmill sitting just outside of the kitchen, and so we had, you might say, running water in the house. All you had to do is turn this spigot on the bottom of this barrel light, and you had running water. And no central heat. We had a big old heating stove in the front room, and my mother had a big old cast iron cook stove out in the kitchen that she'd done the cooking on. And so this is how you hit the house. When you go to bed at night, you take all kinds of covers because it wasn't exactly warm in the back bedroom, you know. And we had an upstairs in this house, but we never used it. We just kept that shut off. We just lived downstairs. And I forgot to say I had a sister too. My sister Mary was at home yet when we lived on the farm. And my brother John Jr. and me. John was the oldest, I was the middle, and Junior was the youngest. Mary was older than any of us. And then, that's not all my brothers and sisters, but that's the only ones that lived on the farm with us. My brother Jim lived with my grandparents on a big farm over by Lion Lake.
With the Caseys?
With the Casey, with Grandpa and Grandma Casey. My mother and Dad had trouble keeping him in school, so they took him over there, and they seen that he went to school and back every day. And then my brother Howard was living in Albion, working in Albion. In fact, he finally got married, and then him and his wife moved upstairs on the Greenfield farm. Like I told you, wasn't nothing up there. Well, they had a, you know, like an apartment really, but not real modern apartment. Didn't have running water and all that. They had to get the water from downstairs and carry it upstairs. and we didn't have any inside plumbing. We had a little outhouse on the back, and everybody used that. And if you never went out on a real frosty morning to an outhouse and you've never been anywhere, and nobody you'd hurry right out and hurry right back just as fast as you could go. And so anyway, then
Tell us about the sheep being born.
okay, then one of the things that always fascinated me being a young boy was where the sheep come from. You know, I kept thinking, my God, every time we bring these sheep and put them in the barn for the fall, you know, a lot of little lambs. I remember this. We had triplet lambs, we had twin lambs, and 2 black lambs. You know, the lambs are usually born white, and my dad would usually have to stay up all night when it's time to deliver the lambs, you know, in case there was any problem. And so when we go out in the morning, out in the barn the next morning, where there'd be all kinds of little lambs around there, and so the sad part of it was if one of these mothers would die in birth, then nobody else, all the other lambs would reject this lamb and wouldn't let it feed from her. So we'd have to take him and bottle feed him, take him in the house, put him in a big cardboard box by the stove and bottle feed him until he got strong enough to then after a while, maybe another ewe, that's a female sheep, would lose a lamb, and then she would accept one of these orphans as hers, and that way, you know, it evened out pretty good. And then I remember the little pig. Again, my dad would have to stay up all night if the pigs was being born, and some of them was some of these sows, which the female pig would have a litter of maybe 12 or 13, 14. I think the highest I remember is 16. And she wasn't too careful, and sometimes if you didn't get right out there, it wasn't right out there when she had them, they'd crawl around trying to find the teats on the mother to eat from, and maybe she'd roll over on them. So if my dad see there was a problem, that someone wasn't getting anything to eat or anything, he'd put them in a box. I remember how pink and fuzzy they was. He'd put them in a cardboard box with a towel or something in the bottom of it. Then my mother had this big cooking range in the kitchen, and she'd drop the oven door down, and we put them little pigs in there and warm them up real good, and pretty soon they was laying down, and pretty soon they'd stand up and you could hear them in there oinking around. Same way with lambs. Once in a while you'd get a lamb that was born and it was real cold. Although we had a real warm barn, but the lamb would be cold for some reason. Not all of them, but once in a while we'd find a lamb that was real cold, so we'd bring him in the house, and my mother would wrap a big towel around it. It would be laying down, and then put it by the oven door. You know, put it up by the oven door for it to get some heat, and then pretty soon you knew the lamb was all right when you'd hear him go, bah, bah. You'd go out and he'd be standing up. Well, then my dad would take him back out to the barn and put him with the rest of the lambs. Same way with the pigs when they got, you know, so he thought they was stabilized pretty good. He'd take them back out and put them with the mother. But another thing you had to watch too, some of these mother pigs, as gross as it sounds, some of these mother pigs would eat young. If you wasn't there, that's why you had to be there when they were first born. Because before they got up and wiggling around, she'd start eating them, you know. And so.
You had quite a few horses too.
And
Tell us a little bit more about them.
We had 4 horses. I'll tell you what the names is. Barney and Molly. We usually worked them 2 together because they were pretty well matched up. Then there was Flora, like I said, that we rode around the yard a lot. Then there was Dick, big old Dick. He was the oldest one. And he was a great big wide horse. My dad let us ride him around too. We'd ride him down the potato field and back. And then then my dad figured we needed another horse. So they bought a horse. They bought a horse over north of Marshall. And there wasn't any horse trailers or anything, you know, like there is today to haul them around in. So my brother Jim went over to ride the horse home. And it was a little Western pony. It had the brand on it and everything. It come right from out west. And his name was Prince. Real nice little horse. Just the workingest horse you ever seen. You could hook him up with the biggest horse we had, and he could keep up with it, maybe a little bit ahead of it. And so I guess I've talked long enough, so I'll quit. But that's some of the stories I've